That was a well-deserved round of applause for Steve Rogers. He did a great job of laying out some of the key elements of what is blockchain, how does it apply to business. You all, through your questions already, have made my job both easier and harder. Easier because you've asked a bunch of really interesting questions that I think it'd be useful to hear all the different perspectives. Harder because I had a list of questions, and now we'll have to work them in. So anyway, my name is Alan Cohn. I'm the co-chair of the blockchain and digital currency practice at Steptoe & Johnson. We work on all aspects of, obviously, blockchain and digital currency related issues, which means in the parlance that Steve noted, virtual currency, also open blockchain applications. You can build other applications on Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum, as well as private permissioned enterprise networks of the type that Steve mentioned. I'm joined on the panel by Susie Adams, who's the Chief Technology Officer of the Microsoft's federal government business, by Dr. Leon Bruner, the Executive Vice President for Science and Regulatory Affairs, and the Chief Science Officer for the Grocery Manufacturers Association, and Alan McQuinn, who's a research analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. So with your permission, I'm going to just jump right into the questions, and please go ahead and add at the beginning anything that you'd like to add. So, I'd like to start, and I'm going to kind of come across. Alan, I'd like to start with you as a research, as someone who's looked at the different technologies. Maybe add a little bit of flavor around these different types of blockchain applications. Steve mentioned the Bitcoin blockchain. Steve mentioned Ethereum, both its open and its permissioned environments. Is there anything? Give us the 1 minute addition to the things that you've looked at for how those different blockchain applications apply to industry and particularly supply chain trade industry.
If I may, I'd like to take a step back and show how blockchain fits into the overall financial ecosystem, if I can, and then I'll dive into that really quick. So right now, financial services is having its Skype moment. And what do I mean by that? Remember when you used to make international phone calls, and they would be routed through multiple different phone companies, both at the local, the state, the international, and the national level. And because it was so intermediary driven, it was an incredibly costly service. But recently, with the advent of Skype, companies have been able to use IP-based phone calls to cut down on these intermediaries and save money. Think about it. When was the last time you had an international phone call on a landline that cost you money? It just doesn't happen anymore. The same thing is happening in financial services writ large. It's because these single dedicated networks are giving way to general purpose, cheaper networks, like the blockchain. And so we see this happening across the industry. So we see multiple different types of blockchains. And when you think about blockchains, you think about, a lot of people generally think about the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain or cryptocurrency. But cryptocurrencies writ large have a lot of problems. They have a lot of problems because they fluctuate in value, because they have cybersecurity risks for the applications that sit on top of them, and because they're prone to speculation. But the underlying technology, this shared ledger, this blockchain technology, is what is really at heart in the financial services industry. We see banks using it for their shared services between different banks and for their internal services. NASDAQ is using it for security training. A report in 2015 from Santander estimated that by 2022, if banks incorporated blockchain technology into their services, they could save between $15 and $20 billion a year. So we really see this writ large across the financial services sector.
Yeah, that kind of contextualizes for you where how you see this particular technological innovation slotting into the larger financial technology and financial industry challenge. So the way that I've always thought about blockchain, as it was originally explained to me when I first learned about it, it's kind of three elements. You have this peer-to-peer exchange network, which can be you to me, which could be all of us as counterparties, being able to exchange, both transact value, that's kind of its original function from a cryptocurrency, or other items of value, whether that's, as we talked about, letters of credit, identity, and other types of information, secured in a secure environment. Second, a distributed append-only ledger, as Steve explained. Both append-only, write-only, this chain of blocks, as well as distributed among all of the participants, multiple copies. And then this consensus validation mechanism, which works differently in different environments. Leon, as you've thought about this technology for in the context of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, what jumps out as you as the most valuable piece?
Actually, I put together at the request of Ken just a little short deck that I can take people through and describe how this might be useful. So if I could have my slides up here, this will take just a couple of minutes.
1 second, we're going to pull that up.
So as he's getting the slides pulled up, we'll start up talking a little bit about the food supply chain. And the food supply chain, I thought, was, as I was putting this together, and if I can get this to work, let's see. Okay, we'll start off with this little, I got it right here. Okay, so it's got this little Dilbert cartoon that says here, your user requirements include 400 features. Do you realize that no human would be able to use a product with that level of complexity? And his answer is, good point, I better add easy to use to the list. And so with that in mind, I've mapped out the global food safety system, and the user requirements here are pretty extensive. I'm by no means going to go through this. It's the reason for putting this up here is that this is a massively complex system that is open to fraud, it is open to incompetence, and it is open to error. And so when we think about blockchain, we think about it as a tool that can possibly help us. So in the food industry, we're starting to talk about this concept of food integrity, and food integrity is the quality of being honest and the state of being complete and whole. And there are a number of elements that when we're thinking about food integrity where blockchain could be applied, and some of those are things like food fraud. Am I sure that what's in the box is what's on the label? Food defense, is there something in a food product that will cause me harm? Food authenticity, is the Alaskan halibut actually from Alaska, or is it actually halibut? You can think of how the supply blockchain could help us with that. Food quality is what's in my product again, is it true and made correctly? And finally, microbiological safety, blockchain has applications there. And then finally, food security, do we have enough food, and in food nutrition. So in all of these areas we can see blockchain having applications. And why is this important is this type of blockchain technology can bring transparency, and we know today that transparency is one of the major drivers of consumer trust. So there is an application for blockchain actually to build the trust and confidence of consumers. So where is this being used? Steve, you mentioned that you're doing some pilots with Walmart, and recently in the press there was a discussion about how Walmart is using this to help them track mangoes through their supply chain, and the production of pigs in China, for example. And where it's been applied is Frank Yanis, who is the head of safety at Walmart, has said what used to take us a week to track back through the supply chain, I can now track mango information within seconds, literally from where the mango started to where they've ended up in a Walmart store. There's another firm called Alting in Taiwan that is using blockchain to certify the safety of milk, which of course is a big issue in China and Taiwan. And I understand there's applications, for example, in the fishing industry in Indonesia, all aimed at ensuring the authenticity of foods through the tracking. You know, this is a new technology, of course, and we're learning a lot about it, and we're very excited, and while we think it's really great, I also want to point out that we think the devil is a bit in the details, and we already touched on one of the questions where I think there's a challenge here is that although we have a blockchain that is very solid and indelible to interference, the issue is that we have physical goods to go along the blockchain and track. So apparently, literally, we have cell phone technology that will allow somebody picking mangoes off a tree to enter data about mangoes into the blockchain, and then as the mangoes are taken off the tree and packed into a box, Then what happens is the box gets shipped to distributors, and then from distributors into the grocery store, and then ultimately they end up on the table in your home. One of the big issues here is how do you make sure that you keep that physical asset, if you focus on that middle picture and you see the chaos of that distribution center, how do you make sure that that physical asset of those mangoes comes right back to the question you were asking about the roses a little bit earlier. How do you make sure that those mangoes in the box are flowing along with the supply chain? One last thing, and I've kind of learned this today, is that we're implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act, and I can see how industry could be tremendously helped with blockchain technology in showing that we're complying with those regulations. So I learned something today that was really helpful, and we should be following up on that. So fascinating technology with lots of opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, and that's a great, that fills in other pieces to this general puzzle that I think can help you to begin to think about all the different applications of the technology. So Susie, Microsoft uses the enterprise Ethereum platform as a foundation for your services, and you also have been, with the scope of your responsibilities, interacting with the federal government. Where do you see some of the applications going with the work that you were doing?
Well, a couple of things. So if you look at where Microsoft, what is Microsoft going to do in this space, and why are we even interested in it? And so as a software company, and I think Steve said this is all about software, right? And standing up solutions to help people implement blockchain. So one of the biggest challenges that we see right now with blockchain is even if the technology exists, but how do you actually go about implementing it? It is difficult to implement today. It's like standing up a big Hadoop cluster. And so how do we do, and if you look at kind of the history of Microsoft, what we typically try to do is democratize a particular technology and make it easy for the masses to adopt. All right, so that's exactly what we want to do with blockchain. We want to deliver blockchain as a service. Now, one of the biggest challenges is the language, which, what language is everybody going to support? And so while there are 15 or so out there today, our goal really is to be as open and transparent about and allow people to be flexible with the languages that they want to use. So whether it's Hyperledger or it's Bitcoin or it's Ethereum, we want to support all of them. And the way we're going to do this is through our Azure platform, our cloud, our infrastructure and platform as a service cloud. And now this is a global cloud that has hyperscale capabilities. And you could go in today into Azure, into a console, and stand up, pick the type of blockchain you want to build, say how many nodes you want to build out, and actually walk through a wizard that will literally, you enter in, this is where I want these nodes to live, I want them to live in these regions, I want these people to be my business partners. You can start to create smart contracts to allow those business partners to exchange data and stand these things up literally in a matter of 15 minutes. And then be able to monitor and manage these. Because somebody brought up that Bitcoin had been hacked. And I love Steve's answer because it isn't Bitcoin, it isn't the actual, it isn't Bitcoin that got hacked itself, right, or blockchain, it's the actual applications on top. And so we want to give you a secure platform so that you can build the logic that happens on the front end and the back end, right? Because at the end, all you have is a secure distributed ledger. There's going to be processing that happens before that data gets into that distributed ledger and after. And that's usually what gets hacked. And so we want to make it easy for you to develop that logic, right, and also run the distributed ledger itself. So that's kind of how Microsoft sees, ourselves contributing to the blockchain, the blockchain phenomena that's going on now. Is we want to be as flexible and as open about being able to support all these technologies and deliver it as a service so that people can implement it.
That's great. So let's maybe follow up on a couple of questions that came up. I want and this will help us further explain the technology and its applications. I wanted to start with the question about Africa that was raised in the back. This is kind of thinking about leapfrog technology, thinking about how Africa skipped the wireline communication phase, went right to wireless. If we think about somebody building a customs process from scratch, so we talked about talking to CBP here, and that's they're looking very closely at this. They're being very far forward on it. But when you're talking about where you have a much less well-developed area, you can think about to use some of the things that Steve said, and actually each of you have said. there's a platform that people can be permissioned into, or can otherwise come into where they can begin to exchange items of value through this protocol. Second is the digitization of documentation, right? So whether it's the bills of lading or the letters of credit, whether you're looking at the supply chain management side, on the trade finance side, on the customs revenue side, the documents and the documentation that underpins those processes can be digitized. Then, Steve, you put on the table the concept of smart contracts, which is basically when blockchain originated with the Bitcoin blockchain, it's got a scripting language associated with it. It's just it's difficult to write in. So it has a basic functionality as a currency, as a token. It's hard to program other functionality into it. When Ethereum was released, one of its features was an easier scripting language. And one of the things it was optimized for was scripting in simple if-then statements. So if this happens, then have that. And then on the top of it, as Steve said, you want to have a source of truth, referred to sometimes as oracles, which is basically just all the parties agree to point at one single source or one aggregator for the if. So if this happens, this oracle is going to tell us, yes, that has happened, and then it triggers the then. So the if could be goods arrive in port. Goods arrive at 12 miles out in territorial waters. And then the then can be, based on the documentation, the payment of customs revenues, not dockside, not at the office at the port, but into an account owned and verified by the government. And then with the open traceability of the blockchain, you can then audit that, whether that's the government itself, whether that's the people, whether that's an outside agency. What other aspects how can we build on that piece? How can we build for the notional country that wants to do this? How else can we use the blockchain to solve that problem? The blockchain technology to solve that problem.
Okay, that's a good one. But I like your analogy associated with the phone, right? Because, why build a land-based network when you can go straight to cellular technology? And I think you'll find that blockchain has a tremendous amount of application because of its low cost, right? In lots of different places where that kind of infrastructure doesn't exist today. As a matter of fact, I think it will be slowed down in its adoption by the existence of the existing infrastructure, as opposed to places where that infrastructure doesn't exist. I think Albania is the #1 blockchain-oriented country in the world. They vote on blockchain, they get government services on blockchain, and the reason why is because they said, well, we're a mess.
Is this Estonia or Albania?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. It is Estonia, right? And they were kind of a mess. And they said, all right, we're going to start. What's the best technology out there? And they picked blockchain, and now they're a huge applier of blockchain technology to governmental services. So I think it's actually going to be attractive to countries that don't already have an existing infrastructure, don't have legislators that move legislations that move at glacial paces, right? When somebody can make a decision and make it happen. So, anybody else want to comment?
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that if you look at just how are we, and somebody brought this up earlier, how are we going to change what we do today, and how are we going to legislate that, given everything else that's going on? I think it's going to be our biggest hurdle, very similar to if you look at the adoption of cloud computing. Right? Cloud computing, we all used to think that the data could follow the sun, and it could live anywhere. And we quickly found out, in fact, somebody said, and I guess I see the same thing happening here, if you put it in the cloud, the lawyers will come. Right? And that's,
hey, let's not get for sure.
Now lawyers are my best friend. Because that's true, because the regulatory environment has not caught up. Right? Data location, data access matter. The same challenge I think we're going to hit with blockchain, right? Because there's a lot of money in intermediaries. right? And so just as, with the cloud, there's a lot of money that you're, especially look at the federal government. The federal government has a mandate now to move to cloud computing. Well, there are a lot of people making a lot of money running systems for the federal government right now. And so there is a tug of war happening, right? Where there's a lot of FUD going around, it's not as secure, so I can see the same type of struggle happening, especially in the US, around adoption of blockchain, because I think everybody, you can tell that the technology, the concept is amazing, right? But there are going to be naysayers that say the technology is not proven, it's not secure, with headlines like, Bitcoin got hacked, I think it's gonna be our biggest struggle.
So let's follow up on the remedies question.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on what you said, we've talked about kind of, and then jump in. Let me rephrase. Let me see if there's other comments, and then let me come back to you. So we have this question that you have a technology protocol, a layer that people can, or businesses, industries can come onto and create kind of a shared truth, a shared ledger that's auditable, that's immutable. You can add smart contracts on. You can have if-then statements that, and you can identify where they point to. But there's always going to be disputes about plenty of things. That's what they teach you all about in law school. So where do we think that the ability to create a smart contract, an if-then statement that everybody agrees on, an oracle that can be pointed to, what kind of disputes that we see now in trade and supply chain management do we think can go away? Where are we going to need to see either regulators change the regulatory application, or where are we going to need to see, in a sense, technology come forward to almost create new, arbitral or remedies for blockchain-based technology, knowing that there's always going to be human disputes somewhere there?
Well, so this is a really great question, right? Right now, governments are just beginning to tackle many of the very important questions surrounding blockchain. From general questions like who defines asset ownership over a shared ledger service, to really specific questions like whether you can enforce computer code as a legally binding contract. And we're seeing different governments tackle and look at blockchain technologies and fintech technologies differently all over the world. Canada, Russia, and France are all looking at how to assess and to quote-unquote regulate the blockchain, or rather assets over the blockchain. And so it's important that we look at this issue it's important that we try and prevent them from creating a mismatch of different rules over a global technology. Because blockchain is at its heart, in the financial sector at least, a financial market infrastructure, which is regulated by different financial regulators and central banks everywhere. But it's incumbent upon the international community to look at this and be like, all right, well, how can we reduce some of the burdens and the inefficiencies that we create with our regulation onto this new service that's creating so many efficiencies? We don't want to counterbalance them. And we see this in other areas with every government has a financial regulator already, but we have the Basel Committee to kind of create international standards for the use of this, at least in the financial sector. So we're going to have to see some of that going through and how we can disparage some of the differential laws, right?
And in a sense, you can think about, on the one hand, you can build in current trade remedies that have become part of treaty or international law into the smart contract, either into the contract itself or into a third-party remedy entity that you can point the smart contract at. But that also raises the question of, well, then that means that the code needs to be read by both parties before signing, and there needs to be a true meeting of the minds around that. So without boring everybody in the legal details, the technology offers the opportunity to take the body of knowledge and jurisprudence that's been done in in trade disputes and also in other types of disputes, and actually build them into the automated contracting function and have the system address the remedies question. At the same time, though, it raises the complexity of the system and places additional demands both on the company and on the lawyers to understand what the code is saying and how it will execute. Because this goes to the anecdote, Steve, that you talked about with Ethereum and the DAO and the DAO hack, where this argument comes up of does the legal regime we're all familiar with govern, and this is just a way of automating that, or is this its own law through contractual, that we've all agreed to through contractual mechanisms, and however it executes, that's the resolution of the dispute. So it's an interesting challenge.
Not getting into the legal aspects of this, but I think many of business disputes are simply this issue of, well, my system tells me X and your system tells you Y, right? And if you have this common ledger and you're both looking at it, it's Z, right? The data, and there's only one Z. There's the data that's in the shared ledger. So, in our global financing business, we finance over $40 billion a year, and we have over 25,000 disputes. When it comes time for somebody to make a payment, they're saying, well, the following is my view, and you've got a different view, and we're eliminating those by having only one view. So a lot of it, I think, you can solve problems that don't require legal solutions simply by having the power of that common ledger, and you can eliminate many of those disputes. I'm doing it on the procurement side of my business, and it's always something deep in the contract, some term and condition that I didn't know existed or they didn't know existed, and we're really arguing over whether or not this contractor gets a meal allowance, right? And when you code that into the smart contract, it executes, and everybody sees how it was calculated, and you just eliminate the disputes, and you don't have a legal dispute. So I think there's tremendous advantages. Not to undermine your comments, that I think when you go internationally with a lot of this stuff, you are going to have a lot of issues. But I think there are a lot of things you can do that are not legal issues. They are simply just, we disagree on data.
Right. So other questions? Here in the front?
Okay. Mike Bruner's coming around now.
Oh, thanks.